Flatland. The book that somehow manages to be about geometry, Victorian classism, and the crushing inevitability of intellectual despair, all in less than 100 pages. If you've ever wanted a story where a literal square has an existential crisis about higher dimensions, congratulations, you're in the right place. Edwin A. Abbott's Flatland, A Romance of Many Dimensions, is one of those books that sounds like a cruel joke. It's a Victorian novel about math. But don't let that scare you off. Beneath its rigid geometric exterior lies a work of savage social satire, unhinged metaphysics, and just enough cosmic horror to make H.P. Lovecraft weep into his tentacles. The premise is deceptively simple. Our narrator, A Square, lives in a two-dimensional world where everyone is a shape. Women are mere lines, dangerously sharp and somehow even less respected than in actual Victorian England. The lower classes are isosceles triangles, just barely intelligent enough to hold tools, but still sharp enough to stab you. Respectable tradesmen are equilateral triangles, while professionals like A Square himself are, you guessed it, squares. The more sides you have, the more powerful you are, until you reach the priestly class. Circles, or as they like to call themselves, God's favorite polygons. Society is built on oppression, eugenics, and strict geometry. A Square takes all of this in stride, completely unbothered by the rigid hierarchy. He's a middle-class professional, after all. Life is good. That is, until he starts having dreams. First, he imagines a one-dimensional world where the poor wretches can only move back and forth like a malfunctioning Pong game. Then, in an event that can only be described as what if Plato's cave but worse, A Square is dragged, kicking and screaming into the third dimension by a smug and condescending sphere. And this is where things get weird. The sphere tries to explain the concept of up, which, for a Flatlander, is about as comprehensible as explaining Wi-Fi to a medieval peasant. A Square, to his credit, resists. He protests. He throws every bad faith argument he can think of, but the sphere, like an interdimensional door-to-door evangelist, is relentless. He yanks A Square into Spaceland, where our poor two-dimensional protagonist has his first traumatic encounter with depth. It is a moment of existential horror. He sees the insides of closed objects. He comprehends volume. He realizes in an instant that his entire world has been a lie. And what does he do with this revelation? Naturally, he tries to take it one step further and asks, what about a fourth dimension? This, apparently, is a step too far. The sphere, previously a champion of higher thought, suddenly turns into an angry Reddit mod. He shuts down the conversation immediately. There is no fourth dimension, he insists. That's crazy talk. You might think A Square would learn a valuable lesson here about questioning authority and pushing intellectual boundaries. Instead, he does what all great visionaries do. He goes back to his own world and gets arrested for heresy. His fellow Flatlanders, utterly uninterested in the third dimension, promptly lock him away, leaving him to spend his days muttering about cubes and extra height in a Victorian insane asylum. So, what's the point of all this mathematical misery? On one level, Flatland is a thought experiment about dimensions, a fun little exercise in how creatures of lower dimensions might struggle to comprehend higher ones. But underneath the math, it's a brutal satire of Victorian society, a world where class, gender, and intelligence are rigidly assigned at birth, and any attempt to challenge the system is met with scorn, exile, or a swift and politically convenient execution. And it gets even darker. Abbott suggests that we, yes, us three-dimensional meat sacks, might be just as blind as the Flatlanders. Just as they cannot see height, maybe we cannot see the fourth, fifth, or even sixth dimensions. Maybe we are the ignorant shapes, trapped in our own limited perception, incapable of seeing the greater reality beyond. And if a four-dimensional being ever tried to explain it to us, we'd probably lock them up too. This is what makes Flatland so brilliant. It lures you in with quirky math and absurd satire, then sucker punches you with existential horror. It's like if Alice in Wonderland was written by a mathematician who had seen too much. Despite being nearly 150 years old, the book is still wildly relevant. Its social commentary still lands. Its mathematical ideas are still referenced in physics, and its central theme about the crushing weight of institutionalized ignorance feels, if anything, more timely. So if you ever find yourself feeling a little too comfortable with your understanding of reality, give Flatland a read. It might just ruin your perception of space forever.